China dies this decade. This is a short version. Their demographics are now so atrocious that we're looking at having the population halve between now and 2050. And that's primarily through aging. That assumes no breakdowns in the input systems that allows them to have energy and grow their food. With just that, the entire economic model will collapse before 2030. If we have disruptions to energy, and this is a country that imports everything in its energy sector, you are looking at a deindustrialization well before that. And with COVID, we're seeing manufacturers up and leave as quickly as they possibly can, because this is now the new norm for China. China's vaccine doesn't work versus Omicron B. And so China is no longer a partner in reliable international supply chains. So everything that can go wrong in China right now is going wrong. The Ukraine war is particularly problematic because it means they're going to lose energy from the Russian space and probably even a lot of food from the Russian space. They're probably the biggest losers out of the war after the Ukrainians themselves, obviously, because they're the last country in the kick line. Everyone else gets their stuff first.
So that is, I'm going to say that's controversial and perhaps push back a bit and say, doesn't China have a ton of naval power, military power? Does it not have a pretty good record of innovation, or at least not every country is innovative in itself, but they can be fast followers and adopt and adapt. More countries do that than not. And China has proven very good at doing that. So if Japan was faced with very challenging demography, which it was, and invested overseas to build production overseas and built a navy to protect, why can't China do that? Indeed, I would argue it has been doing that.
I'd actually argue that it hasn't worked out for the Chinese on any of those measures. Let's start with the copying and the innovation. China makes low-end stuff. They do assembly. And I don't mean to suggest that's insignificant. It's a critical part of the process. But the Chinese cannot make the machinery that makes the low-end stuff. They have to import that from somewhere else. They can operate it, and they can operate the machinery that makes the mid-end stuff, but they can't make any of it themselves. About 80% of the value added in the Chinese economy is from imported parts. That makes them the king of the assembly and the masters of the low end, and that is critical. But that is not what allows you to be an independent pole in international economics, especially since all of their other inputs come from anywhere else as well. And unlike the Brits, and unlike the French, and unlike the Turks, and unlike the Indians, and unlike the Japanese, they can't go to get what they need. On paper, yes, the Chinese Navy is huge. It has more ships than the British, the Japanese, and the American Navy combined by a significant margin. But 90% of them can only go 1,000 miles from shore. And that assumes that they're going in a straight line, not zigzagging and not under attack so they can go slow to save fuel. Under combat situations, you're talking 400 miles. So in any war scenario where the Chinese are involved, someone, India, Japan, the US, someone, Australia, is going to put a couple destroyers in the Indian Ocean basin, and that will be the end of China's energy imports. There's no way deglobalization breaks for the Chinese in a positive way. And we've seen with the Ukraine war that everything that they thought was true, that the war would be quick, clearly not. So they now have to apply that to Taiwan. That no one will sanction Russia. Well, that didn't work out. And so they now have to consider that there might be sanctions on food and energy. With the Russians, that's an export issue. That's a numbers issue. With the Chinese, it's an import issue. It's a national survival issue. And I think they were really floored by all the boycotts. The idea that private citizens can have an influence over corporate policy, they have no frame of reference for that one. So everything that could go wrong for the Chinese is going wrong all at the same time right now. And we're seeing it start to break down to their decision-making system.
China's economic rise, China's the number of people that have seen their incomes rise, however you want to set the poverty level, has been astonishing. And it's been an amazing achievement.
I agree on every point. And now we get to see it go in reverse.
Okay, so let's finish up with a couple more countries. Brazil. Why not Brazil versus Argentina, or can they both succeed together, or why have you selected Argentina over Brazil?
I think that Brazil's going to collapse, but I think their golden era is over. The Brazilian farmland, most of it, especially in the northern 90% of the country, the area that was reclaimed from tropical savanna in particular. It has no nutrient profile in the soil. So it is an input story. And in a world where the Chinese are ravenous consumers and finance is cheap and all the inputs are easily available, Brazil is a success story because you're basically growing food in a petri dish, and the petri material itself is the fertilizer. If you break down that supply chain system, you're in a semi-tropical desert and you're looking at yields simply not being possible. So the extreme southern provinces that are kind of an extension of the Pampas region in Argentina, they can still grow, just not at the same scale. But those northern ones, that the story of the agricultural explosion in Brazil over the last 20 years, that just stops. And if anything, we get a small volume of crop and some low-grade beef, and that's about it. In Argentina, it's actual soil. It's a bit like the American Midwest or the Midlands region in the UK, and it's prairie soil. It rains, so the inputs are low. You use fertilizers to get higher crop yields, not just to get crop yields. So we can see the Argentinian output being more or less in the future what it is now, and if they change some policies, increasing significantly. But Brazil has had its moment, unfortunately.
Okay, so one more country, and then we'll wrap. Russia.
Oh, wow. Okay. I never bought into the hyper-optimism of the last couple of months for the Ukrainians. I mean, don't get me wrong. They have outperformed by every possible measure. I don't see how they win this. The Russians have more men. They've got longer-range weapons. They've got a better logistical system. And despite all of their problems, they have a very, very, very deep bench. Whereas the weapons that the Ukrainians can use are limited in supply. First, the former Soviet satellites are providing them with some older equipment that the Ukrainians can use right now. And then we're trying to train up the Ukrainians on a number of other weapon systems, of which in the United States, the Javelin and the Stinger are the most famous. Those are all available in very limited supply, and we'll probably run out of all of them this year. Against that, you have low morale Russian conscripts operating 30-year-old tanks that have been inexpertly maintained, going against unarmed Ukrainian infantry. There's no math there. So the Russians will pour over the Ukrainians, and I think we're going to be dealing with a war of occupation within a year, and which will just be the next phase. But this is Russia's last war. The Russian demography was the worst in the world until the Chinese screamed by them a few years ago. This is the final century for the Russian population. And what they're fighting for right now is to try to establish a more coherent defensive perimeter where they can concentrate forces in things like the Polish Gap, where normally they've been invaded through. And if they can do that successfully, they will probably last another 50 years. If they fail at that, you're looking at the Russian system collapsing in less than 20. And whereas the Chinese system is very heavily densely populated, so a breakdown in supply chains means mass famine and mass return to the countryside, Russia, despite all of its faults, is still going to be producing enough food and energy for itself. So it can disaggregate into kind of a regional principalities model like it used to be, and cease to be a regional power, but still be a recent regional center weight. You will never be able to ignore Russia if you are on its border, but it will degrade in time into a series of competing fiefdoms. Unfortunately, they also have nukes, and that is something we will have to stress about a few years from now.